Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In the Spotlight. I'm Mike Kenichi. I'm very excited tonight. When you talk about the people who do the magic behind the scenes, this guy is no stranger to that. He's had stops at WFAN. He currently works for Wireless Media. He makes the magic happen, all the great sound bites you see in radio and stuff like that. He's it's guys like him who make it happen. It is my honor to introduce to you the one and only Mike Erickson. And Mike, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a real honor.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Mike, let me ask you, how did the love for I know like you've done more behind the scenes, but how did you first decide that you wanted to get into broadcasting?
Probably when I was a kid, I was always curious as to why radio stations played certain records. And I used to actually, my mother would buy albums, and I would start writing on the back of the albums on paper that was taped to them, the different radio stations I would hear the songs on. And that's basically what got me started in broadcasting. Just the theory of programming and why it's done and why certain songs became hits and why other songs didn't. And I wanted to be on the air, and that's where I wanted to start. But admittedly, I was not very good on the air when I was 19 years old. So I went to look for a different field, and that's when I got interested in engineering and how things sounded and troubleshooting problems and making things work that way.
Right. And let me ask you, Mike, because nowadays it's I don't want to say it's easier, but it's a better tool for people, especially when it comes to editing. I mean, you could access the computer. It's a lot easier. When I went to Connecticut School of Broadcasting, they taught us how to edit, and we had to take the reel tapes and we had to kind of splice them together. We had to cut just to make it work. I mean, how hard was that? I mean, when you were doing that early on in your career, because that's not always easy to edit like that. And no, it seemed like no matter what station you listen to, though, those engineers never missed a beat. They got everything right on cue.
Well, there's a lot of the engineers who do some of the work, the on-air talent who took phone calls, especially at like top 40 stations where they were doing, call-ins for requests and things like that. And there were some people who were wizards with working like that, like Broadway Bill Lee, who works at CBS FM, was one of them. Kate Kelly, who worked at Z100. These people would be able to turn around a reel-to-reel recording very quickly and edit it and make it sound like it's legitimate. When we started working at FAN, when I started working at FAN back in '96, we were still using reel-to-reel, and we would have two machines going. One was basically logging the entire game, and the other one was where we would cut highlights from. So we would sometimes have to edit the highlight and then put it onto what's called a tape cartridge, which looks like an 8-track. And then at the end of the broadcast, at the end of the ball game, they would do the highlights and they would play them off that.
Right. So let me ask you, I mean, obviously you enjoy doing it, but I mean, were there times when you were stressed? Because I mean, one thing they always teach you too, especially in radio, is you live and die by the clock. And I mean, you got to have everything on time. There's no margin for error a lot of times. So, I mean, were you stressful at times doing this?
Well, the biggest stress was actually like during a football or a baseball game where in the baseball game every run is recapped at the end and in what at the time was Mets Extra, and you would be editing it, and then someone would hit like a back-to-back home run, and then you'd have to edit the one and then go over and stop the other machine and edit on that one. So, it's sometimes when there were quick scoring plays or like someone scored a touchdown and then there was the return kick, the kickoff was returned for another touchdown. Those were the times where it got kind of stressful. Baseball, especially because it's easy, to just rack up runs, 2 or 3 or 4 hitters get a hit in a row, and then you're going back and forth and recording each scoring play and then carting it up and getting it ready for Mets Extra. So those were the big stressful times when you just had to turn it around and make sure that you don't have both machines stopped and then another run scores and then you don't have that highlight. And then, Gary Cohen would have to skip over that, or Ed Coleman would have to skip over that, and would just banter and say, and then the Mets added 2 more runs and explained the plays because we didn't have the highlights because we couldn't get them turned around. We ended up getting machines called shortcuts in the late 90s, and those were digital editors, and that made turning things around so much better. You could mark where the highlight was and then go back in the middle of an inning, in between innings, and highlight it and edit it that way, and then start recording again once the next half inning started.
And the thing is, too, Mike, that people don't realize sometimes as well, whether it's a Mets broadcast or a Giants football game, or it's a show for Mike and the Mad Dog or whatever it might be, guys like yourself, if that show starts, say, I'll just use Imus as an example. If his show was starting at 6 o'clock, his producer, engineer, you name it, they had to be there sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning, correct?
Correct. With Imus was interesting because Charles did not write his own news. He had a news writer, so Charles could come in a little bit later. And the engineer would usually show up about 5 o'clock in the morning to do the show. There were 2 sets. There was 2 engineers. One was someone who actually ran the console, and that was Lou Ruffino. And then Dick James was the engineer who was back in what we call the wire room or the terminal room. And he was the one responsible for hooking up Imus with the network, making sure that the network feeds stayed up, and just basically monitoring the show in case there was anything that happened, if the transmitter went off the air, or if there was, a profanity that wasn't caught by Lou that ended up getting on the air. He was like the backup. He was like the goalkeeper. And made sure everything stayed on the air while Lou played the commercials and the quacking duck that Imus was famous for having and putting the guests on the air. Lou did that side of it.
Right. So let me ask you, Mike, again, we talked about it. You started FAN 1996. What was like your first couple years there? What did you mainly do at FAN those first couple years?
A lot of it was remote broadcasts. I would do the evening shift. I would be basically the back end of Mets broadcasts, making sure they're on the air, just like Dick James with Imus. And I basically did a lot of the remotes. So FAN, especially in football season, when, September and October were very busy months because you had baseball, and we were still doing baseball remotes and things at that time, Shea Stadium. And we were also doing football remotes. We would do like, a Monday show with Tiki Barber was one of the guests, Michael Strahan, or someone like that. Someone from the Giants would come down and do a show with Bob Papa, and then we would, find her. It'd be at a restaurant in Manhattan, and every year we would do that every Monday night. So I did a lot of that early on. And then I moved up to doing more on-hands work in the studio, basically through the rest of my time at FAN until I was promoted to CBS FM as their chief engineer. So I went from basically the guy who ended up going out on the street and doing the grunt work, which is basically, trying to find parking in Manhattan, dragging all this equipment, across Fifth Avenue to a restaurant, trying to find a place to set up, getting the remote connected. I went from that to being the guy who was the one who sent other people to do that. So it was kind of like, I ended up going from, the bottom to all the way to the top before I left CBS.
Now, did you enjoy doing remotes, Mike? Because I know some people really love them and some it's not their cup of tea. I mean, did you enjoy going out and doing the remotes?
I enjoyed a lot of them. When they were planned out, the remotes went very smoothly. There were then some remotes that were like spur of the moment, all hands on deck, especially when we were covering like the Yankee parades, because they won in, 98, 99, and 2000. So, we didn't know there was going to be a remote until they clinched. And they usually have the parade, in the next day or two. So we had basically 48 hours to order radio lines for us to set up the remote, find a place where we were going to set up the remote, and then basically go down and check it, and then have someone there in the morning really early to set up because we wanted to get in before all the local TV stations got in and before the crowd started amassing and all the city officials that would show up and want to be a part of the ticker tape parade. So
Yeah.
that was basically those kind of remotes were difficult to do. And I did only one Yankee remote. A couple of the other engineers, by the time I did the 98 one, the other engineers did the 99 and 2000 ones, but I only did one of those. And last minute changes can be a problem too. We used to do this. I don't know if you remember. Mike and the Mad Dog used to do this remote called Fiddler's Elbow, with the Imus Teed Off Challenge, and we would go out there, and the night before, all of a sudden programming says, well, we want to do this now. And it's like all of this was set, and now you've got to arrive in the morning and change gears and adapt to something new that programming wants to do, probably because Imus or Mike or Chris said they wanted something else. So then we had to add that on top of what we had already planned. So last minute things were a challenge, but somehow we always got them done. And that's the way it was.
And let me ask you, Mike, how difficult is it sometimes? Because, I mean, the host from when I would listen to WFAN, they definitely appreciated what the guys behind the scenes did. But there are times they had to get frustrated because they're trying to get something on or somebody's mic isn't right or stuff like that. And, sometimes they have to be demanding because they're trying to do a 5-hour show, whatever it is. How difficult was that at times dealing with the host? Because you got to make them happy too.
Well, what we tried to understand the host. We did mic checks before. We would always end up showing up at a remote 2 hours before to get set up, 3 hours if it involved television. So once Yes and MSNBC got involved with Imus, the report time was 3 hours before the remote. And we had to do audio not only for obviously FAN, we were also the clean feed for Yes and MSNBC to take all of Imus's audio or Mike and Chris and their guests. So we would make sure that the headsets were good, that we had level checks before, Mike and Chris would sit down and the cameras would focus and they would, adjust lighting as needed to make sure and the backdrop and everything was up. So we rarely had problems. The biggest problems we had were at the time they used this system called ISDN, which transported audio from the site back to the station. And ISDN, while it was high quality audio, was not as reliable as what is used now, which is basically IP codecs over the internet. We didn't have that back in the day. So if an ISDN line went down, we would have to use a phone line backup. And that's when the hosts would get annoyed. I mean, they realize it's not our fault, but still it's like they need someone to vent to, and you're the person in their view, and you're the one they get to vent to. I basically rub it off, and at the end of the show, you shake their hand and they say, good show, you got through the problem, blah, blah, blah. And there was only one remote I was ever on that we had to totally scrap the remote, and that was we did a remote at Belmont racetrack on the Friday before the Belmont Stakes, and NBC, which was covering the race on Friday, had sliced through a bunch of cables that took us off the air. So we had to abandon the remote. We couldn't continue. Phone line, ISDN, everything was gone. So what happened is Chris and Mike left. They played a little bit of best of Mike and Mad Dog. They actually went over to Mike's house because he's in Manhasset, and they actually did the rest of the show from Mike's studio in his house. So that was kind of fun. So that was kind of funny.
So let me ask you, number one, I mean, at the time you came there too, it couldn't have been a better time if you're a sports fan. I mean, the Yankees went on that big run. I mean, the Knicks had some great playoff moments towards the end of the 90s. The Jets had got Bill Parcells and they started to win a little bit. And then, of course, the Giants went to a Super Bowl or went to a few before you left and won a couple. So let me just ask you, what was it like just seeing the sports world of New York back then working for FAN?
Oh, it was very busy and very complex. A lot of times we were doing a lot of remotes at Yankee Stadium was one big thing. Mike and Chris being at Yankee Stadium, especially when the Yankees went in the playoff, Mike, we'd be there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the game didn't start till 8 o'clock at night because it was in the ALCS or the World Series, and we needed to have access to the building because Yes was also doing it. We needed access to the building at 10 o'clock in the morning, and a lot of times programming, I mean, I don't really want to blame them, but programming would not set this up. So we'd show up at 10 o'clock and there's no way of getting in the building until Yes showed up, and then they had, better access to it. You have to remember at the time, we were the Mets station. So yes, we were not as, welcome at Yankee Stadium as if, the Yankee affiliate was going to do a show there. So we got in, we would set up, we would always get on the air. And then the big thing was to break down. So we would have to start at 1, we'd get Cashman on, they'd get Jeter on, they'd get Torrey on, they'd get a whole bunch of interviews. And then the people at the station would turn one of the interviews around and replay it at 6 o'clock because we needed to empty where we were so someone else could use the area by 6:30 to set up for the World Series broadcast. So there was like a very thin line of time between when we signed off and the room and the box, the press box we were in, needed to be used by somebody else. And oftentimes we were in the same press box where John Sterling would be broadcasting the play-by-play, and we needed to get out of there so their engineer could get in and set up, and John could get ready with all his stuff. A side note is one of the funny things is Bob Shepard stopping me in the hallway and pointing at a piece of paper and asking me, "How do you pronounce this name? Is it blah blah blah, or is it blah blah blah?" And I said it's blah blah blah. So I actually gave Bob Shepard a tip on how to pronounce someone's name because it was a World Series and it was a National League player, and he had never come across the player before. So I thought that was funny. But everyone at the Yankees were great. I'm not a Yankee fan, but everyone at the stadium was pretty great once we got in there. Bob Shepard was classy. John Sterling was a great guy. I did the remote where it was George Steinbrenner and John Sterling, and that was when George and Yogi Berra got back together at the Yogi Berra Museum, and they made amends, and that was probably the best remote I ever did. That was the most fun doing that remote at the end. George, you're sitting there, and there's George Steinbrenner, and and there's Susan Waldman, and in comes Yogi Berra, and they're hugging and everything, and then they sit down and they're talking, and it was really one of the best remotes I did was the Yogi Berra Steinbrenner reunion.
Yeah, and you think about some of the highlights the fan had. I mean, they I think when George got reinstated in 1993, Susan did the first interview with him. She had him on the air that day that he was reinstated. And then, of course, she brought up the Yogi Berra thing. And, another thing, too, it was a very it was a very tragic moment. But one thing that I really admired about all the people at FAN, whether it was hosts, producers, engineers, is the work they did when terrorist attacks happened. Because, I mean, those guys were working round the clock. I think Imus was coming on the air 3 o'clock in the morning then. And I mean, having to do something like that was very hard, and everybody stepped up their game because that was just a horrible time, as everyone knows, in America.
Well, one of the things I remember about 9/11 with WFAN was we dropped sports because obviously there was no sports going on, and obviously there was more important things. And the station became basically the town square for New York. People would call and ask, "Have you seen blah blah blah? He looks like this." People would just call and vent about what happened, or it would get very emotional on the air. And the hosts basically became sounding boards for everyone trying to deal with the tragedy that happened. And this went on for days. And WFAN really became, the community came together around WFAN because all the other stations were either doing all news. We were basically doing, just opening the phones to the people and letting them, have their say about what happened on 9/11. And I thought that was some of the most compelling radio I've heard anywhere, FAN or not. And it was definitely something that was very, very interesting to witness and to watch unfold on the station.
Yeah, it definitely was. And like I said, I mean, because I think it was a good 2 weeks before the station got back into sports. And even when sports came back, it took the station honestly, till probably the last week of the baseball season to really start focusing on sports again, because that's how bad this was, as everyone knows. And it was just very hard. I remember, I'm a Yankees fan, and I was, saying to myself, could they win 4 in a row? And then that happened, and it was almost like, you know what? I don't even want to watch baseball. I mean, this is just horrible. So, I mean, I remember it took like a good 5 weeks before FAN callers started calling and talking about sports again, and even the host. I mean, when you've got Joe Beningo, who loves sports, and he can't bring himself to talk about it, you know that this was just an awful time.
I think one of the moments after 9/11 was the first game at Shea.
Yes.
When Piazza hit the home run.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was like when they turned the switch on. But you're right, it did take a little bit more. And then the Yankees made the playoffs, and obviously the NFL season had kicked off. So over those few weeks, and then, hockey and basketball was starting up. I think once you got into October and the Yankees were in the playoffs, and the Knicks and Rangers and NFL going on, that's when everyone started to the healing process from 9/11, and things got back to some sense of normalcy on the air with the radio station.
Right. So let me ask you, Mike, I mean, you had to have some fun moments being behind the scenes. I mean, you talked about it before. Sometimes you had to make sure that if you had like a caller who pranked the station or stuff like that, you had to make sure you got those things edited out and stuff. But I mean, there had to be some fun times. I mean, I always think of this. I think of a guy like Jerome from Manhattan, a caller. It had to be fun if you were just sitting in that studio or behind the glass and just listening to him rant and rave. I mean, there had to be those days where like it was so enjoyable just to listen to passionate New York fans talk.
But it's funny because we used to run, and I used to hear a lot of stuff from Jerome that never made it to air for obvious reasons. But we would run to audio loggers, and a logger is basically just a recording that records the radio station. One logger recorded everything before we were able to dump, and the other logger just recorded what was on the air. So there were a lot of, behind the scenes things that never made it on the air that we made a little tape of, that we would play and just laugh at, callers making mistakes or saying things that they shouldn't be saying. And, that kind of stuff was kind of fun. But, there was a lot of good camaraderie between, the people who were in engineering and, who were actually producing the show and screening calls, and the people who were in the newsroom editing the tape, writing the updates, and doing things like that. So everyone worked together as a team. I was on the night shift a lot. We would go out sometimes after dinner, or we would order dinner in if it was a busy night. Sometimes we'd have, a Monday night Giants football game, a Mets baseball game in late September, and a must carry, because we had some, even though it was a preseason game, we had some must carry Rangers or Knicks games, and you would have 3 sporting events going on at the same time. And then we would order dinner in because there was no time to go out. So because we just had to be there to make sure that everything stayed on the air, we used there were 4 studios in the station. We were using 3 of the 4 studios and feeding different affiliates and different networks and everything. So it could become complicated. But I mean, I look back in those times and I kind of miss it. FAN had a lot of soul when it was in Astoria. Yeah. I don't want to say anything negative about it, but I think when they moved to downtown Manhattan, it lost a little bit of its New Yorkness, and it became a little more corporate rather than a little more, sports, fun, ha-ha type station. There, it was like Astoria was like Shea Stadium, and downtown is like Citi Field. Mets fans love Shea Stadium. It was a dump, but it was their dump, and that's what kind of Astoria was. It was, wholly really unusable for what we were trying to do. We produced 9 hours of live TV from Astoria in a studio that was built for a country music station that turned into a sports talk station.
Yeah.
We produced 9 hours of television. The major TV stations in New York don't produce 9 hours of live television a day. We produced more live television per day in that facility than any other video TV facility in New York. So it was amazing we pulled that off with what was available to us, and basically space. We ran out of space to put stuff in for Yes and MSNBC. We had equipment that was basically in the hallway. We had to move mailboxes and cabinets out of the way just to put equipment in. And we had, just wires going through the ceiling to the other side to make it work. So it was really like, it looked like, if you went in there, it looked like a mess, but it was our mess. And it was organized disorganization, I guess is the best you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that it wasn't the same to me when they went to Manhattan. Number one, I missed the 718-937-666 number because that was legendary. And then just the studio, like I didn't care that it was a small studio. It was so cool to look at. I mean, it looked like, big time radio stars who worked in a small building. And I thought that was a big reason why they were just so good, because they knew they didn't have an extravagant building, but they made the most of it. And I just felt like it was a shame when that happened. It really was.
Well, they made the most of it. And one of the problems we had, the idea to move downtown was actually born in 2003. Now, we didn't move downtown until 2009. And one of the biggest problems, like for the hosts and for the engineers, was they would request things and we would request things, and we were turned down by corporate because, well, we're not going to invest in Astoria because we're going to move out of there. But, our side was, well, we still have to operate. So we do need this stuff. So every time we needed something, for mic or something, or like a new, on-off turret where you could turn mics on and off, or new microphones or a new microphone stand, or something for, the automation system we eventually put in, so we could come off of tape, because we were on tape cartridges till 2005 when all the rest of the industry had already gone to computer automation, and they didn't want to do that in Astoria because they didn't want to make the investment. But eventually they realized, they're going to be there a couple more years. We have to do it. So the last 6 years the station was in Astoria, the plans were already to move downtown. And the idea was, well, we don't want to put anything into Astoria, but we still need to keep it on the air. So we had everything, basically we had to scratch and claw to get from upper management that basically didn't see the place every day. They were in an office building in Manhattan on the 40th floor. They didn't see the building every day, so they didn't realize the necessities we needed just to keep it running as it is.
Right. So let me ask you, Mike, guys like yourself, guys like Ray Martell, Bob Gelb, Chris Carlin, I mean, Eddie Scazzeri, all these guys, was there a bond between a lot of you because you knew the type of work you guys had to do to make, like I said, to make everything work at FAN behind the scenes? I mean, did you guys bond over that a lot? I mean, it seems like you were quite close with a lot of these guys.
Yeah, we did. As a matter of fact, what's funny is I got a funny Chris Russo, Eddie Scazzeri story. Eddie at the time was the engineer in the studio for Mike and Chris, and Chris Carlin was the producer. This was before Mark Malusis. And we were on a remote one time, and there's a baseball player from 40, 50 years ago. His name was Mike Epstein. And one time Chris thanked me and called me Mike Epstein instead of Erickson. So every time I would pass Scazzeri, because he heard it, I'd pass Eddie, he'd say, oh, it's Epstein. So we would make jokes like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ray was cool. I did some stuff for Beningo. Like if the Mets had a big game, Joe would come in early to watch the game because he wanted to be in the atmosphere of the FAN studio. So he would come in and watch the game. Or if the Jets were on Monday Night Football, he'd come in and watch the Jets. And then when they won, we'd put together a little highlight reel with some music like Celebration by KC and the Sunshine Band or something like that with the highlights interspersed. And that's how Joe would open his show. He'd play that back and then talk about the Jets won, and go into that. So, yeah, we had a camaraderie where, if one person, needed to step away, someone else could slide in and, help them out. We all helped each other out. And, we had a good time. Sometimes one person would treat everyone to dinner if we had to call it in instead of going out. We had a really good camaraderie going on. It was a very tight-knit group, especially the nighttime people, because it's not easy working second shift, and it's even worse working third shift. And it was tight. It was tight. And, everyone I worked with not only enjoyed the sports, they enjoyed and understood the technical end of it, which was good, because
Right.
you needed to know both ends. It wasn't just knowing stats and projections and things like that. It was knowing how to edit audio. It was knowing how to put together a post-game show, things like that. So everyone basically knew. And I, coming from both enjoying programming and engineering, I kind of also got both sides. And I was a sports fan too, mostly baseball. But I was a sports fan too, and I understood enough of it to know what to do. Especially when we used to do the Giants remotes out at the Meadowlands or the Jets when we would do the parking lot remotes on game day at 9 a.m. when we would start the pregame show for a 1 o'clock for a 1 o'clock kickoff.
So let me ask you this. I'm glad you brought up baseball because I wanted to ask you this. Obviously, the two big names in New York, one said goodbye to New York, one is sticking around. So I want to get your opinion on both of them. So talk to me first about Jacob deGrom. What were your feelings on that and him signing with the Texas Rangers?
I I honestly don't blame him for a couple reasons. One, he's obviously never gotten run support. We know that. I mean, he won the Cy Young Award with 9 wins, but he was so good that you couldn't overlook that. He was losing 2-1, 1-0 games. And I think the big slap in the face was going out and getting Max Scherzer last year. And then he's the one that's starting, the play-in game, and he stunk up the place instead of deGrom. I mean, deGrom, kind of carried the Mets into where they are now and stuck with them during the bad days. So, I mean, he's going to go to Texas. They're not going to be competitive. He's got a big contract for somebody who's not pitched more than 90 innings since 2019. He's got a big contract. He's going to have his payday. He's not going to probably ever get a ring, but, at least, he'll never have to worry about getting another meal for the rest of his life. He'll be, well taken care of in this. You could make an argument for Hall of Fame. Sandy Koufax had a very small body of work, and he was just completely dominant. So you could make a case, but Sandy had rings too, and deGrom.
I think Jake's got to have a couple more dominant years. If he could get two
Yeah.
more dominant years, I think he'll have a shot at the Hall of Fame. But I think he has to have at least 2 more, in my opinion.
Yeah, the
But
problem is staying healthy with him.
But the one thing that I didn't agree with, Mike, as far as Met fans went, I have no problem with Met fans being heartbroken. I have no problem with them feeling like, he left them behind. But the one thing I have a problem with, and it's not just Met fans, I've heard it from guys who cover the Mets, guys who, were big fans of deGrom. They're trying to make this seem like this is no big loss and he was always hurt and stuff. I mean, for 4 years, all these people did was talk about how great he was and how much they loved him as Met fans. So I get you're hurt, but I feel like that's you're kind of overshadowing that because you're mad that he left.
Right. I think a lot of the Mets fans also like the fact, and this is what I've gotten from talking with Mets fans, was that DeGrom was homegrown.
Yeah.
And Jeter was homegrown for the Yankees, and now Judge is homegrown from the Yankees. And the Mets want their own. I mean, except for Tom Seaver, and with the unfortunate side of Dwight Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, the Mets really have not had very many homegrown superstars. Piazza was a trade. Bobby Bonilla was a trade. The Mets have not really had that. Jose Reyes, was good for some time and then fell off. So the Mets have never had that homegrown talent where the Yankees had Bernie Williams, they had Jorge Posada, they had Derek Jeter,
Mariano Rivera.
Mariano Rivera. They had all that homegrown, and you look at the Mets and it's like it's a pieced together team. And the Mets fans want like another Tom Seaver, someone who is, all time that came up through their system. And, DeGrom, with a little bit maybe different type of handling, could have been that. Pitch counts, you go back and 40 years ago, you look at pitchers, Nolan Ryan, 180 pitches in 12 innings to win a game 1-0 in extra innings, and he strikes out 17 batters, and he's throwing almost 200 pitches in a game. I think the pitch clock has, kind of babied a lot of these pitchers into unless you're, in Game 6 of the World Series and you need an extra inning out of your starter, you're looking at the pitch clock and they get to 100, and then you're quick to yank them, and they're only in the 6th inning. And there's no, you're not building up their arm strength by doing that.
So let me ask you now about Judge. I mean, he ended up staying. What a crazy couple of days. I mean, they had him going to the Giants. It didn't happen. What I thought was interesting was all he asked the Yankees to do was match the offer. He didn't ask them to go past the 360, which anyway you look at it, it's a ton of money. It's not like he took a pay cut. And I think some people think that, but that's a ton of money. So it's not a pay cut. But I do think that ultimately he proved he wanted to stay a Yankee because he did not ask them to go past what the Giants offered them.
Well, I think the limelight and the lifestyle in New York, you're in market number one, and they're probably going to name him captain. So, he's the next Jeter, obviously with more power, but he is the next Jeter. He's now the face of the Yankees and pretty much, the face of the baseball. It's basically him and Ohtani are the big faces of baseball right now. So, Judge staying in New York, rather than going to San Francisco is not playing in obscurity, but, it's not the same market as New York. So I think staying in New York for the same amount of money, and I think not taking the contract deal that was offered to him at the beginning of the season, he really cashed in. He bet on himself to have a season like he did, to get the contract that he got now. So, which he wouldn't have gotten if he would have had, a pedestrian 40 home run season. He wouldn't have gotten. He had a season for the ages. His WAR was 11. So, that's huge.
Yeah, it definitely is. So let me ask you, Mike. I think it was 2009. It might have been 2010. You stepped away from FAN, and I think you're currently with Wireless Media, correct? And just talk about what was the reason to leave the Fan, and how do you like what you're doing in 2022?
The reason I left FAN was because I got a job offer in North Carolina with a company that I would make more money with, even though we were union, even though it was a non-union job. And it focused on one aspect of engineering that I liked, and that was audio and making it sound better and using devices to edit and create better sounding audio. And I was really obsessed, for lack of a better term, with that. So I took that job, and that job lasted 10 years. And the company ran into huge financial issues with COVID and laid off 70% of the staff, and I was part of the 70%. And the department I was in with the company has now been greatly downsized, and they're actually getting out of that business. So I wanted to get back into doing that. So I formed my own company, and now I work for contract with other companies that manufacture similar equipment to the one that I work directly for. So that's basically what I'm doing now.
Right. And I mean, you think about it, Mike. I mean, you've had a terrific career that really started in 1991. I think you were a part-time DJ for a while, for a good 3 years. So really, you've gotten over 30 years in the broadcast industry, especially in radio. So, I mean, you got to look at it. I mean, I don't care what your position is, whether you're a big time host or you're behind the scenes or whatever you may do, marketing, whatever. When you're in that business that long, you're doing something right. So you have to be proud of your career.
Well, I mean, I am proud. I'd go back and change a few things if I had to. Um, one of my biggest problems is like I kind of tell it like it is sometimes. Um, but I'm proud of where I am. I'm proud of what I've done. Um, are there better people? I mean, I'm not saying I'm the best at whatever I do. There's always somebody with more experience. There's always somebody who has a different insight on something in particular. So when you're in radio or broadcasting in general, there's stuff you still learn every day. After 30 years, there's still stuff I learn every day, whether it be like just a new way of doing something or a suggestion from somebody on how to make something sound better. You keep learning, and people do turn to somebody as an expert. But as an expert, there's sometimes I'll go to other people and say, I'm going to give them this answer. Do you think this is the correct answer? And, it's nice to, more times than not, they say, yes, that's a good answer. Sometimes they'll say, you may want to phrase it like this, or you may want to also suggest something else. But as far as, I'm pretty sound in my knowledge of what I'm doing with the audio side of it, that I can give somebody advice and be confident that that advice, without hearing the product and without actually seeing how they're controlling it, I can tell them to turn this, and turn this switch on, and put this dial to 8 and put this dial to 6, and it'll sound better. And they'll do it, and they'll say, oh wow, that does sound better. And that's just me talking to them over the phone, knowing what the product does and knowing what their settings are and where they want to go. And that's basically what I'm doing now.
Right. So let me ask you, Mike, like I said, you've had a career in radio for over 30 years. I mean, is there one particular moment that you did in your career that you said, wow, that was my favorite thing I ever did in radio? I mean, can you find one, or has there just been so many, it's hard to pick one?
There's been a few. One was being at CBS FM. The first time I was at CBS FM was when they relaunched, when they were Jack, and then they relaunched CBS FM. That was a huge moment. Great day. The other time was the George Steinbrenner Yogi Berra thing gave me goosebumps. And as I said, I'm not really a Yankee fan, but just to see them get back together. And my early days in radio, when we were working for a radio station on Long Island that was bankrupt, and paychecks were bouncing, but we were still doing what we were doing on the air because we were just having fun. So my early days were a lot of fun. The Yogi Berra thing, CBS FM was a lot of fun. And basically my move to Michigan was because I like where I'm living in Michigan right now. And, I'm a cold weather guy. The lakes here are gorgeous in the summer. It never gets too hot. It never gets too snowy either. So I've kind of got the best of both worlds, and I can work remotely. So it's after 30 years, I'm finally in a position that, I have basically the best of both worlds, but it took 30 years to get there.
Right. Let me ask you this, Mike. I mean, if the opportunity ever happened, not even on a full-time basis, but just like every so often, would you ever go back to WFAN for a special like program to do or something like that? Would you ever go back like on a part-time basis?
Oh, yeah, I would. I would definitely go back to FAN. There's
Yeah.
probably a lot of people there who don't even remember me. I think Bob Husler and Rich Ackerman would probably be the only update guys left that would remember me. John Minko's gone.
Yeah.
Most all the hosts have, turned over. You know, Joe Beningo, is loosely affiliated now. So, a lot has changed. Most of the engineers have retired that I was working with because they were in their late 50s and early 60s when I started there. And they were retiring as I left. And one of the reasons I made the move was because um, the engineers I had worked with were leaving, and I had this opportunity to do something I wanted in North Carolina, and I decided to pull the plug. Rather than hang around with having to get used to a new bunch of people, I decided to go pull the plug and go work for a company where I already had made some inroads because I had done some stuff for them on the side. So that's basically what I did. But I would go back to FAN. I definitely
Right.
would. I have no animosity at all to FAN. It's still the preeminent sports station in the country, and it's still the best of the best. You have to be the best of the best to host a show on FAN.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's just for me to be able to interview people like you and so many of those guys that came from that station. It's a real treat for me because really, I mean, as a guy growing up, I grew up on that station, and I mean, just so many great memories. And it made you really appreciate radio because of the stuff that WFAN put together throughout the years. And that's really a credit to everybody that worked at that station. And I mean, I really do applaud them.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of work that went into a lot of things, and you would listen to it, and we made it sound so easy, but at the same time, there was so many complex moving parts, especially when you were working with Yes and MSNBC, and then just the affiliates. That at one time, Mike and Chris were carried by a station in Albany. And one of the fun things we used to do was Giants Camp. When Giants Camp was at Albany, was up in Albany, was one of my favorite times because I would take a day off before and after, and I have family up in the Albany area, so it was an excuse to ride up to Albany to see family, and I would get a remote done too. So you got a little bit of work and a little bit of play. So those were good times.
Right. Well, Mike, I really do appreciate you coming on today. It was a real honor for me. It was a lot of fun. And I mean, just to think of the stuff you've done in your career, I mean, it's really remarkable because, it's not easy doing the type of job you do. I mean, it really isn't. I mean, I'm sure it's been fun, but at the same time, I could really appreciate the stress that you and so many guys that have done the work you do go through on a daily basis. And the fact that you've had this outstanding radio career for over 30 years is a credit to you and the dedication you have. So I really do appreciate you for that. And I appreciate you coming on today. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I thank you, and I'm humbled by your comments about my career. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure being on with you.
I really do appreciate it. And folks, I mean, never underrate the type of job that the people behind the scenes do because the hosts are tremendous and they do an unbelievable job. But it takes a team to make it all happen. And what guys like Mike Erickson, Eddie Scazzeri, Chris Carlin, Ray Martell, Bob Gelb, and I'm probably missing a couple and I apologize. But the work they do to bring great radio to you like they do should never go unnoticed. And Mike Erickson, to me, is one of the reasons why WFAN was such a successful radio station. For In the Spotlight, I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.